Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Will Strong. I'm the co-director and co-founder of Autonomy, a small independent think tank, which started about 4 years ago, and our focus is on the future of work. Welcome to the launch event of a new resource that we've produced in collaboration with Common Knowledge, who will be introducing themselves in a second. I hope we've managed to bring together a nice panel of kind of different voices around this debate. We've brought in ourselves and Common Knowledge, who designed the resource. We're going to talk through a little bit about what that resource is, what work inquiry is, why we've done this project. We've also brought some of our colleagues from UVW, who will talk as workers in their own field about why this kind of thing is important and why they think workers inquiry could be a useful tool going forward in terms of their workplace activity and kind of knowledge creation. And we've also brought Kam Khan, who's a friend and a research affiliate of Autonomy, to talk through some of the wider issues around workers inquiry and what its significance might mean today. So I'll let everyone introduce themselves one by one as they as we go through the event. But for now, I will start by just introducing who we are and what this resource is in very broad terms. Gemma's then going to go from Common Knowledge, is going to go into some of the details as to how we went about the user interface. And hopefully it will inspire you to go and check out the site itself and play around with some of the techniques and materials we have on there. So let me just present. Okay, hopefully you should be able to see that. So for those that don't know, we're a small, as I say, a small independent think tank. Our focus is on work in the broadest sense, whether it's unpaid work, employment, shadow work, commuting, welfare, and so on. A lot of our work focuses on the shorter working week. And I guess part of the DNA of our organization, as well as Common Knowledge, is a real interest in some of the more heterodox and radical approaches to work that we've seen over the last 100 years from various, let's say, worker collectives or thinkers, intellectuals, as well as some of the more radical elements of the trade union movement. So this project really is right in line with our long-term interests, both organizations, and Gemma can speak for Common Knowledge in particular. So I think usually we're putting out reports, briefings, different data sets, different kind of more macroeconomic forms of output. But for this project, which I think is quite interesting and exciting for us and really a real pleasure to work on, we're producing a kind of a toolkit or a resource, let's say, of some of the more interesting material from the radical histories of the 20th century and 21st, in fact. And we hope that this is something which is, in line with some of the principles of political education, but also just very useful to collate things all together. So what is a workers' inquiry? And I think I've just tried to distill this into a few bullet points. So a workers' inquiry, and I think the name itself is not that helpful these days, but it's been the traditional name of these kind of things, is really a form of research and knowledge production by and for workers or staff themselves. So instead of, let's say, research being carried out by an academic or an organization from outside the workplace and kind of producing data and a kind of knowledge as an external, even if they are participating in a kind of like workplace study, even if they're embedded within the workplace, they're still outsiders to some extent. So instead of that form of knowledge being produced, a workers' inquiry is really done from within the workplace, from within the labor process itself. And the idea is that this produces a different kind of knowledge, one which is qualitatively different to a kind of external researcher kind of looking in. And I guess what's interesting for us about this different kind of knowledge is that it's created using various methods. So it's no longer just a simple interview or simple survey. Often the methods used by different collectives across the last 100 years have varied dramatically. And I think if you look at the resource we've produced, you'll see like a kind of what seems like kind of crazy, slightly out there methods used in an experimental fashion by different workers. And that's what's really interesting about this. It's not just a standard qualitative sociology you might study in university. Now, I think perhaps another defining feature, or maybe the defining feature of a workers' inquiry is really about, it's not simply revealing working conditions, but really about trying to transform them. So often this knowledge produced by different collectives throughout the last century has really been intended as the basis for a particular struggle in the workplace, or a kind of information collection to be used as part of, it might be as part of collective bargaining, or it might be as part of convincing others in the workplace to do X or Y. So that kind of the kind of purpose-driven research from the perspective of those in the workplace is really what defines workers' inquiry. And it's ultimately it's a very, very easy hinge from knowledge gathering to action. And I guess when we're putting together this resource of all these different methods, who knows what can come of it? But it's ultimately in the same manner. We're also thinking about ways in which producing new kinds of knowledge in your workplace can also help build the case for certain demands as well. So I'm not going to go into the long history here, but it does have a rich history from Marx's first, or the first, perhaps often called the first workers' inquiry, was Marx and the questionnaire to French workers, asking them about the conditions in their workplace, famously unanswered. There's a Johnson Forrest tendency in the US, which is often seen the kind of diary keeping and long form reflections of workers in some of the industrial workplaces of America in the mid 20th century. There's Socialism or Barbarie, a French collective where some of the more famous French intellectuals of the 1950s and 60s kind of emerged from. Ismo, which is perhaps the most famous of these kind of historical episodes where inquiry was used in a variety of factory settings, which I know Callum, who'll be speaking later, knows quite a lot about. And more recently, there's a variety of different kinds of inquiry, including the Kalinko call center episode, where effectively, workers in call centers were trying to devise basically better surveys that people actually answer and so on. And so I think it's worth looking into each of these. I mean, for their own merit, they're fascinating studies. But I think perhaps what I think, and I'm sure people might disagree, but I think the Viewpoint article on workers' inquiry is, which you can find online, that's the image there, is fantastic and an amazing kind of study as to what these are and what links all these different historical episodes around the idea of inquiry. And I should shout out also the Notes from Below Collective, who've been going for about 4 years as well in the UK. They've also got a whole range of materials on their website around, for example, Amazon workers in Italy and so on. So I think it's a rich tradition that to some extent we'd like to see keep going, really. I think, it's something which has produced a great amount of work and is, as I say, a nice alternative to perhaps the more kind of standard sociological methods. One example, what do I mean by this? So I think one of my favorite examples of a worker inquiry method, which has been used at least in the Italian context, but also beyond that, is something which is normally called interview to the double, but we've translated it into interviewing your double because it just makes more sense, basically. The idea here is that, and this is a good example of creating different kinds of knowledge, is that if you ask someone, what do you do in your job role? What's the description of your job? What do you do? What does that look like on a day-to-day basis? Often people will just give their job description. So, let's say in an admin role, what do you do all day? They might say, well, I kind of like talk to clients, I process contracts, and I make sure the day-to-day running of a particular organization runs smoothly or something like that. That's not that interesting. That's a bit of a black box. You still don't really know what it's like to work that job. What interviewing your double asks you to do is, when you interview someone, you don't just say what do you do all day. You say, look, say I had to pretend to be you for the day. How would I blag being you? So what clothes do you wear? How do you when you turn up to work, who do you talk to? Do you need security clearance? Do I need a card to get through security? Or how many doors of security are there? How casual are you with the receptionist? If you don't talk to her or him, will they think that you're kind of being weird, or like actually there's something up because you're being unnecessarily quiet? So you start asking these kind of questions, you can reveal a whole range of different things about the workplace: relationships of power, security, what you need to wear, for example, questions of class, whether some people look down on you and then, for example, speak to you in a different tone. You have to take on a certain persona. So all these things kind of can come out using this method, which in fact, and this is the most important thing, that the interviewee themselves might not know. So when they describe their job, they might just say X or Y, very blanket statements. But when you actually have this kind of interviewing as if you're going to be their double, they suddenly realize, oh yeah, actually, we're hidden behind 5 security doors, and actually I have to kind of speak up to this person because they think they're better than me and things like that. So that kind of revelation is exactly what works inquiry is really about. And I think there are a number of methods. That's one of my favorites, but there's a number of them in there which I think are really quite revealing. Another one, for example, asks workers to sit in a circle and treat a nondescript item as if it was a kind of magic technology, which would make their workplace and their work process easier. And you have to each go around and say, actually, okay, this technology does X or Y. And that reveals some of the hardships and some of the problems that they find in their work they wish could be solved with one magic trick. And that kind of starts revealing obstacles in their workplace and how actually they want to improve their work. You can see where some of this stuff matches up with the Lucas Aerospace kind of episode, the kind of Lucas plan stuff, thinking about how would we change our workplace in a utopia. Okay, so I think I'll just end on thinking through why we do this. Well, I think, as I've mentioned already, I think the information on specific workers' inquiries is quite disparate. It's not really in one place. You have to kind of look for it. There's some good stuff out there, but I think it's worth kind of trying to bring them together in one place. And on the resource on the site, you'll see there is often links to some of the histories for this if you want to find out more. We think we're hoping that people will try and experiment with these methods. I mean, we changed and adapted some of them to kind of update them to the contemporary world and make them more accessible. But we kind of want you and others you think we find these quite fun. They're almost like games. We kind of want you to kind of push them around and figure out which ones work and which ones actually kind of reveal all sorts of stuff and which ones are a bit dud. And I think it's an iterative process. So what we're excited about is launching this, seeing how some people will use it, and potentially adding to it in the future. Maybe create kind of building out the archive, adding videos and things like that. There's lots of potential here, and we kind of want to just get it out into the world and see what people thought of it. But I'm really pleased with what we came up with, and I'm glad we managed to engage with some of this historical material and bring it to life in some form. I think it's also important to note that what we're not doing here in a way is we're not a trade union or a worker collective, and we're not trying to actually do the inquiries ourselves. We're to some extent common knowledge and autonomy. We kind of, I guess our specialty is kind of researching, collating information and presenting it in an accessible way. And what we try to do here is bring some of that past to life, and then for others to kind of engage with. So that I think I'll leave it there and pass on to Gemma, who can introduce herself. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Will. Yes, hi everyone. I'm Gemma from Common Knowledge, and we've been working with Autonomy on this for the past. It's been in the works for a year now or something like that. So we're really excited to kind of see it in the world. I'm just gonna share my screen. Cool. Can you see that? Common Knowledge is a not-for-profit worker co-op. We have 4 members at the moment. Just to kind of briefly introduce ourselves. So we kind of focus on designing and building digital tools. But as well as that, we kind of have quite a broad definition of what constitutes a digital tool. It's not always super kind of shiny new things. I guess you'll see in this example, a lot of it is about the content or repurposing existing tools, and particularly training people how to use them and to actually organize or facilitate, use tools in the sense of kind of ways of meeting with people or facilitating a meeting, that kind of thing. And we do research and strategy as well, although often quite rooted in, I guess, tangible outputs. To that end, we've kind of done a whole variety of projects, which all kind of have some form of self-organization at the heart, but lots of different ways into that. So sometimes it will be about kind of directing people towards a particular event. And sometimes it will be about, giving people the kind of resources in order to do something that's completely offline, which this one is more about. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the process behind getting to this Transform Your Work toolkit. a bit of a kind of breakdown of like how it works and how you can use it yourself. And then, yeah, where we hope it will be able to kind of go from here. So in terms of the process, so this is all based on like some really amazing research by Autonomy and their kind of associates. So we really started this where we were like digging through all this kind of content, also trying things out ourselves and like trying to work out ways that we could like break down and like make everything like really accessible and kind of the same, somewhat standardized like structure. And we were also kind of looking at like different examples of these kind of recipes and like game instructions or like, different kind of guidelines and like what worked and what didn't. We decided eventually to kind of go with this like no code prototyping approach. So we used a tool called Notion, which is, I guess you can use it for like to make a wiki or like, it can also be like a project management tool, that kind of thing. And the idea behind kind of using this instead of, like kind of building a website completely from scratch is it really allowed us to like test out ideas and like solve problems super quickly without having to like, invest a couple of months on making something completely out of the box, because we realized that Notion kind of did everything that we wanted to do. Just as easily as kind of making it ourselves. It also allows anyone to really like update the toolkit. And I guess our kind of long-term vision would be that it's not just like autonomy and common knowledge kind of gatekeeping this toolkit, but like if we could kind of let other people like access and like maintain and like contribute as well, that would be like the dream. And yeah, basically it just gave us a load of out of the box features and like we could drag stuff around and everything. So as part of this process, we kind of had this like rough version of it, and we did a bunch of testing like super early on. And so with that, we were kind of trying to talk to people from like a range of professions and like organizing workers rather than kind of trade union like officials with like less knowledge of workers' inquiries, because we were trying to see like what's valuable without like having to know the kind of whole academic background or like history of workers' inquiries. And we tried to kind of, understand what their organizing needs are and like how they might actually be able to use some of these methods. And how we could kind of use this to improve the prototype itself. We got a lot of red stickies after these user testing interviews, which is a lot of kind of negative feedback, I guess. And one of the things that we realized is like, it was just a bit too much information and like still too theoretical. And, kind of overwhelmingly people were asking for like more kind of visual, multimedia and more real life context. So we tried to like, introduce more of this to the resource and kind of rewriting things. We actually reduced the amount of times, for example, that we mentioned like workers' inquiry as a thing, because we thought maybe it's a bit alienating to use this like phrase everywhere, whereas people might not actually think of it like that. And kind of added illustrations and like, multimedia examples, that kind of thing. And we also supplemented like where it felt like different methods were missing. So we added quite a few like, interview techniques from feminist research methodologies as well. So how to use the toolkit. This is like a screenshot of the homepage, which has a bit of introduction. And then the first thing you kind of see is approaches below that. And so the way it's kind of broken down is you have approaches and then methods and tools within that. So the approach is kind of like the overarching category. So for example, one of the approaches is visual research. And it has a number of methods within that. So photo diaries, map making, etc. And so you can kind of take different approaches, but there's lots of different like things within that can be kind of mixed and matched between them all. And some of the methods actually fit into lots of different kind of categories, and the tools are kind of related throughout. So with each of the approaches, you kind of can see like the purpose of like doing that particular type of research and why it might have an advantage over something else. And then you see a breakdown of kind of the in practice where you can go into more detail, and then the like overall context and references, that kind of thing. So for example, these are two examples of approaches. The diary keeping one would probably be more useful if you want to kind of gain a deep understanding of like other workers' experiences or document your own experiences. So it's really kind of quite qualitative and quite personal. Whereas something like the network mapping approach is a pretty simple and quick and like quite visual way to get like a bird's eye view of like the power dynamics of a workplace. And you can see at the top there, you can kind of see all the relations of each. So within network mapping, you can kind of look at the whole network. You can see like affiliation networks, which is the like kind of second step of networks away from the main one, personal networks, advice networks, etc. And then kind of real life examples. We would really like even more real life examples. So I'll explain at the end how to kind of submit as well, because yeah, we'd really love to see more of this. So within methods, this is a bit more like a kind of recipe. So it's like much more focused on one singular thing, and it's like step-by-step guides, like the kind of time you need, the people, etc. So this is one example for geoethnography. So it might take about 2 hours. You need to just be able to record your conversation between two people and have space to meet. Obviously, that could also be online. And then, of course, tools. We focused on just finding tools that were free or very cheap, and just, you know, everyday tools that you can kind of find anywhere and hopefully, you know, are already aware of. The thing with all of these is they're probably like tools that, you know, a lot of people are familiar with through their own work. And that was also what we were kind of thinking about, using something like Notion for this on a kind of like meta level. The idea that you can, like, a workers' inquiry doesn't need like expertise or anything special or whatever. You can kind of just use things that you find around in your everyday life and still be able to kind of create this knowledge that we're talking about. I guess with one thing to say with all of these, you know, approaches and methods, etc., is that it's all really meant to be a kind of introductory, like, yeah, an introduction to these ideas, and that a lot of the kind of organizing research then happens offline, and there's like signposting to like be able to go deeper if you want to read about the theory. So some hot tips for using it is, yeah, like I said before, you can kind of mix and match different ones. So not everything will be relevant to different workplaces depending on the kind of work. So you can kind of choose just whichever suits your context best. And yeah, it really is meant to be a kind of like entry, like an introductory guide. You definitely don't need to use like all of them at once, or even within each example, like, you know, spend days and days on it, doing like super thorough research. Often it's quite good as exercises. I know Tech Worker Coalition do some kind of almost workers' inquiry things that are just like a workshop in an evening, like with a group of people, which can also be kind of like fun and engaging and social as well. And yeah, as Will said before, ideally it's the first step towards like workplace organizing as well. So it's not just about kind of creating theory, but it's actually about linking it to action. And then finally, we would love to see more submissions. So examples or methods that you've tried or resources or anything like that, even if it doesn't seem to completely fit, because we can, you know, we can work out how to include it, we can add new things, etc. And we'd really love to hear if you do try any of these like particular methodologies yourself, let us know. And hopefully we can kind of integrate that. And yeah, if you just email hello@commonknowledge.coop, that would be great. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Aska. I'm an elected organizer and elected coordinator of UVW-SAW, the Architectural Workers Union.
And I'm Jake, an elected workplace organizer for UVW-SAW as well.
And we're going to speak about Workers' Inquiry we were part of in 2017 to 2019 and how it led to the formation of the first Architectural Workers Union in the UK for 40 years. We're going to speak a bit also about how the tools and practices we practice through Workers' Inquiry are still part of our unionising today. So yeah, let's share the screen.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that we maybe it might be useful to define is who is an architectural worker. So from the beginning, one of the things that was key to us is to think about everyone who's involved in the production of the design of buildings, from not just the kind of I guess the privileged kind of architects or the elite architects, but also thinking about it a bit more expansively and in a plural sense to include, say, cleaners, admin assistants, model makers, etc. So we use this kind of loose term of architectural worker to kind of encompass everyone. And the other thing is that we don't, like any union, obviously accept anyone with the ability to hire and fire.
So in 2017, we carried out a Workers' Inquiry to survey a sector from below, to formulate collective demands and make a strategy to launch a union for the architectural sector. Building a bigger constituency beyond the original group was really key. So we held big open meetings and workshops. And shout out Evening Class, a graphic design collective who designed this adaptable poster template for us. They also carried out a Workers' Inquiry of the design sector in parallel to ours. And we put these posters up in universities around Clerkenwell, where many architectural studios are based.
And so as kind of part of this Workers' Inquiry, we use lots of different methods. So some of the ones that Gemma mentioned that are included on the website. So we did things such as surveying the sector through physical surveys. So I think surveyed over 100 people. We used digital surveys and also one-to-one facilitated discussions, which were then recorded and then transcribed, and we looked at them in a more kind of qualitative way. And then we paired people up across different qualification levels, age and experience within meetings, and asked them to kind of have conversations about their working conditions, as well as followed up with phone calls and stuff like this. And we really saw this as a process of kind of care and a first step in a kind of mutual radicalization, and a key part being that we were reframing our own experiences not as individual but as kind of collective and as shared.
We also used role play, so drawing on things like Burwell's Theatre of the Oppressed. We used role play to kind of act out, rehearse, but also reframe our experiences in the workplace together. So negotiating with a boss or going through the interview process. And it's a really good technique for understanding the underlying dynamics of a situation and then collectively making a plan for how things could be different.
And through this kind of 2-year process, we also formed a series of demands. And we developed these as a group, as a collective at that time. And these were kind of based on our analysis of the key problems within the sector. A big one being kind of endemic overwork, but other ones including kind of low pay, unstable, kind of precarious employment, a toxic kind of sexist and racist studio culture, as well as thinking about the negative impacts of the work that we do on kind of communities, the environment, and other workers.
So we protested outside the Royal Institute of British Architects during their presidential elections to demand the leadership candidates to act on the findings of our Workers' Inquiry. We read out experiences of architectural work gathered through the survey, played loud music and shouted our demands: no more unpaid overtime. We've since shifted our focus more towards collective action in our workplaces rather than lobbying institutions as much.
And so we knew at this stage when we were doing this inquiry that one of the things that we wanted to end on was launching a kind of branch of a trade union for architectural workers. And we knew that, this is obviously important because it's about, as workers, pooling our resources so that we can, access legal support and have greater protections if we take industrial action.
Part of our works inquiry also involved carrying out archival research into previous attempts to unionise the architectural sector, like the New Architecture movement in the late 70s, who formed the Building Design Staff branch of TAS. We did this in collaboration with Concrete Action, a planning activist group. We interviewed members of NAM, learning from their successes and their struggles, as well as physically archiving printed material at Mayday rooms in London.
Yeah, and so this kind of conversation between workers, not just who are currently working, but also people that had previously worked, was a kind of interesting part of our workers' inquiry or the workers' inquiry project that we call it. And yeah, I guess we saw like striking similarities between the conditions that we're currently facing within our sector and the ones that they were facing in the 1970s. And that as part of that, you're looking at a page from a kind of magazine that they produced at that time called Working for What, and they developed a criteria for what a union would be. And so in conversation with them, we kind of developed this further to learn from the mistakes that they'd made, because their branch of a trade union ultimately failed. And so we were trying to learn from that and develop a new kind of branch of a trade union.
So we joined the member-led grassroots trade union United Voices of the World as a new sector group in autumn 2019, joining cleaning, legal, design, charity, childcare, gender-based violence, hospitality, and sex workers. So the tools and techniques we practiced through that early stage of workers' inquiry, they're still integral to unionising. We're constantly speaking to each other about our experiences over the phone in workshops. Our casework structure is built from this model, using work solidarity through structured questions and scenario building, sharing issues and taking action together in every branch meeting.
And as well as that, we continue to carry out formal surveys, especially during the kind of, during the current COVID pandemic. But we also use other tools now, so we use kind of like polls and questions and things on social media like Instagram, as well as developing more detailed, kind of more standard Marxist understanding workers' inquiry kind of list of questions that we send out to people and ask them to feed back into it. We use, as Aska said, role play to kind of train ourselves and have kind of practical conversations with people. We encourage people to keep a record, and diary keep, another one of the things that's on the website. And we use mapping quite a lot. So we use mapping to map our relationships to each other in our workplaces, but also to think about the relationships of our employers and to do kind of strategic leverage research. So workers' inquiry is as much about kind of gathering and recording data as it is. And we use it as well as a kind of form of agitation. So we ask, certain questions to people, expecting certain responses, or to try and get people ready to take kind of collective action. So yeah, I guess just to really finish that, just to say that we're really excited about this resource. There's lots of things on it that we are excited to look into. I mean, Will mentioned this kind of this tool before. So yeah, and I guess we just want to say that we really see that a workers' inquiry is the kind of foundational tool to kind of worker power.
Great. Over to Callum next.
Brilliant, thank you guys, and what a pleasure it is to speak after such an amazing and inspiring example of workers' inquiry in practice. My name's Kam Khan. I'm I guess a researcher. That's a fair description. I wrote a book called Writing for Deliveroo, which is a workers' inquiry into the gig economy or platform capitalism. I'm one of the founding editors of Notes from Below, and I did my doctorate on Opera Ismo, workers' inquiry, and contemporary service work. So, I'm invested in the topic, and it's always fantastic to hear examples of how it works in practice, because I think for many workers, the practice of learning more about your work, the process of being engaged, and exactly having this kind of agitational experience where you're bringing other workers with you, starting to identify unfairnesses that previously might have gone, uncommented upon. and also simultaneously the kind of the scientific experience of learning more about your workplace and how concretely your cooperation is organized to produce profit for a boss. That kind of process is a really dynamic one, and it's fantastic to see that it has relevance for people. And this tool is, I think, a hugely necessary development. When I started becoming really interested in works inquiry, which had been back in 2016 or something, you had to scrabble around on strange corners of the internet and speak or attempt to read bits of Italian and try and basically find out how works inquiry worked. And there were very few technical details of, how do you actually do one of these things? Fortunately, over the last few years, we've seen a bit of a resurgence, not only in the UK, but internationally with works inquiry. And now this is just the latest example of a project that managed to make more dynamic and more kind of concrete the ways in which you can go about constructing an inquiry of your own. So thank you very much for Autonomy, Common Knowledge and others for producing it. And also to Patrick Carmichael, who I know did a lot of the research. Patrick actually put me onto Interview to the Double, the technique that Will referred to at the start, which I used in my PhD. I think the really interesting thing with something like Interview with the Double is that actually what you're finding out is lots of forms of tacit knowledge that people wouldn't otherwise volunteer about their work. So it really gets down to the core of, the things that a worker might not even consider particularly important about their workplace, but which, when considered from like the standpoint of an inquiry, that stuff, that level of detail is actually fundamentally what we're looking for in an inquiry. So yeah, thank you to Patrick for that. Thinking about the role of workers' inquiry at the moment, I think we have to be struck by the fact that fundamentally, the British left is in a very difficult position. I don't say that with any great joy. We currently are at kind of a nadir of the trade union movement, despite small positive signs during the pandemic and over a slightly longer scale in terms of the stabilization of trade union growth. If you look at the average age of a trade union representative, if you look at strike numbers, if you look at any of the really key indicators of how strong our trade unions are, and kind of as a byproduct, how strong our workers' movement is, we are really at a very low point now, lower even than we were when strikes were technically illegal after the Taft-Vale decision back in the very early 1900s. So we are looking at work, and we're looking at class politics, and we're looking at the class struggle in a period when actually, in concrete terms, we're not as organized as we've been in any period historically. So that presents us as socialists who've historically relied on the trade unions and relied on the class struggle in the workplace as kind of our foundational place that we draw our power from. It asks certain questions of us, and primarily I think that question is like, how do we find where the struggle is? How do we find how workers are experiencing class conflicts today, and how do we articulate those into a political project, right? And that's not a simple thing. It's not something we can do by just one or two works inquiries that will solve that. It's obviously a large and ongoing project. But for me, there's this kind of vitally important job of going back into the workplace and understanding the work that we do from the perspective of workers themselves today in order to start to answer that question and deal with that problem. Now, there are two forms of knowledge, I think, that we can get out of a workers' inquiry broadly, right? The first of which would be kind of learning how to struggle. Like I said, the British trade union movement is at a historic low right now. And if you look at how that situation's come about, I mean, historically, we faced a decline under Thatcherism, obviously, with the aggressive attack on the trade unions that comprised primarily in smashing the big organized industries. But actually, if your workplace was organized in the 1970s and it's still open today, chances are your union probably still exists and you're probably a member of a union, right? The real collapse in density, the real lack of trade union organization has come in the opening up of new sectors, right? So greenfield sectors, what we call them in academia, but basically just stuff like call centers, right? In the 1970s didn't exist. Or for instance, the gig economy. These kind of areas where new entire industries have been created and have never been unionized. That's the problem that we're facing, right? It's that private service sector. It's the Weatherspoons, it's the Costa, it's those kind of places where we have a real challenge on our hands, because not only are they not unionized, they've never been unionized. We've never actually worked out a formula, a way of struggling and a way of organizing that can really deal with and address those sectors. I think that's partly why the architectural workers example is such an inspiring one, because what we need much more of in the British workers' movement is people looking at these sectors without a history of struggle, understanding what possibilities exist there, and starting to build movements in those contexts. So it teaches us, in a very basic way, it can teach you the most effective way to go on strike, for instance, right? Once you understand your workplace and what all the inputs and outputs of your workplace are and how the labor process works, not just from your perspective, but from the perspective of everyone within that workplace, then you understand much more concretely, how do we bring it to a stop, right? You'll see opportunities for leverage that weren't necessarily visible beforehand. This is what, I don't think there's necessarily a huge amount of difference with what conventional trade unionism would call power mapping here, right? A way of understanding exactly how you can pull on a certain lever to stop the machine. But that kind of knowledge is immensely important. And notes from below, we've published a lot of stuff from people working at Amazon. We've published a lot of stuff from people working in platform capitalism. We've published a lot of stuff from people who are engaged in these industries with the goal of developing that kind of new buffet of techniques, the new organizational approach that can identify how we build in this context. For instance, one of the questions that we're often coming back to is, how do you best use things like mass messaging groups? So like, how do you use a WhatsApp chat? And how do you deal with the fact that often there's a tension between the function of a worker's WhatsApp chat and the function of a trade union branch historically? Those kind of questions are things we're actively engaged with. And I think for me, in my experience, looking at these questions from the perspective of workers themselves is the only way to really start fighting your way to a concrete answer, right? So certainly, workers' inquiry can teach us how to struggle. But I think there's another way that we can use workers' inquiry, and that's kind of to start to think about and to learn about how we transition out of this mode of production, right? So we all are very aware we live in a capitalism that is rapidly decaying. I mean, you only have to look at events in Germany to see the political stakes of our moment today. You only have to look at the nature of vaccine imperialism to see how brutal our future could be. You only have to look at what Priti Patel is doing to understand the depravities of contemporary British conservatism. We're aware that we desperately need political change, but actually, with the exception of the period 2015 to 2019, where we had a kind of a Corbynist moment that developed lots of new ideas, we're still very short on kind of thoughts about how we make that transition in the contemporary moment, right? There is still a question of how do we move from a society organized around profit, a society organized around fossil fuel usage, a society completely predicated on all of these incredibly damaging forms of, or these incredibly damaging social relations. How do we get out of that? Right. And here, the classical example, people have already referred to it, it's the Lucas Aerospace plan, right? These were workers who looked at their work and thought, well, we can make, rather than making weapons, we can make crutches, we can make heat pumps so that old people can heat their homes. We can do these kind of fundamental, socially useful work instead of producing things that maybe we don't see the social use value in. Now, that's obviously an inspiring example, but there are many others, right? When I was working at Deliveroo, I started to think about universal basic services as a horizon for transition, and the ways in which gradually taking needs out of the market, for instance, food, might offer us a way to view socialist transition as like a constant expansion of services provided free of charge that would be incredibly difficult to roll back. Because, I started to think then, well, you look at the NHS has been under assault for near on 40 years, 50 years now. Much longer, some might argue, but it's been continually under bombardment from the moment it was established. But because of its universality, it's so loved and it's so defensible. So when we start to look at workers' inquiry, not only as a tool to teach us how to organize now, but how we might transition into a better future tomorrow, I think we can see it in its whole value, right? It's not just a tool that can teach you how, when you go on strike, to have the most effective strike. It's also a tool that can help us think about, when we find a political expression for Generation Left, for the young people who are currently being left behind by Starmer's Labour Party, when we find that political expression, when we find another moment like Corbynism, where actually the interests of the vast majority of society can be represented at the level of bourgeois politics, well, like when we get that opportunity, we can take ideas from workers' inquiries, we can take ideas from the front lines of production and scale them up politically, right? Because what we need is a socialist program that taps into people's everyday experiences, that taps into the way that people live in the world, and has an organic relationship to that, rather than being seen as kind of a laundry list of policy that we've just come up with because we have this identity of being left wing, right? So I think those are some of the uses today for our workers' inquiry. I think it has this dynamic quality. The final thing I'd really want to stress is that, workers' inquiry is a DIY methodology in a way. It's something that you have to pick up and work with. No one can give you a course in how to do a workers' inquiry. No one can make sure you're doing it right. There is no completely correct or completely incorrect way to do it. Marx's own survey was 101 questions long, and lots of people, he got some answers, but not very many, right? There's a constant debate amongst Marxists, how many survey responses did Marx get, but certainly not enough to map the entire French economy. So if Marx's own survey was a bit of a flop, well then I think that lets us off the hook, and we can kind of experiment around a bit, even in the knowledge that the original Magic Grandpa didn't get it perfect first time out. So I'd encourage you, if you're watching this and you're interested, then absolutely go use this tool, go talk to workers, go talk to people in your workplace about what it feels like to do your work, about how it's organized technically, about if you face similar conditions in transport, if you face similar problems with your commute, if you face similar problems with landlords, map not only the relationships within your workplace, but also the kind of the modern expanse of working class life. This is a tool that I think people will find useful. The Agricultural Workers Union example is a fantastic one, and one we should all take heart from. But fundamentally, the process of rebuilding a workers' movement, of rebuilding the power we need to get ourselves out of the kind of hell world of late capitalism, has to begin at that granular level in the relationship between worker and worker. And I think that, if we can even begin 1, 2, 3 of these projects off the back of this tool, then we've made significant advances.
Great, thanks, Callum, and thanks to all our speakers. Actually, that was really, really interesting, and exactly what we wanted as responses to this project, which, as Gemma mentioned, was a kind of a lockdown project, which kind of like seems to kind of, for me, mark the whole of the COVID period. So we have a few questions. I think we've got some of our speakers lined up to answer them. One question which was aimed at Gemma, but I think Asker's got some great things to say on it. So I think the question is, can we get the question up? It says, it's a question about tech. Can we get that one up? Here we are. Does technology make technology easier or harder? So basically, I think it's saying, does technology make either organizing or workers' inquiry easier or harder? And perhaps I think there's another question there about, does technology help or hinder in terms of can it be used by bosses as well as workers? So I'll let Asker pick that up.
So technology is, implicitly or explicitly in the boss's hands. There's a good example from our union during the first wave of the pandemic in a few workplaces, but in one in particular, workers were being asked to keep their webcam and their microphone on throughout the working day. So incredibly intrusive, direct surveillance at a point where, we really didn't need that. And technology also, it has to be grasped by the workers just as much as it's used to kind of survey workers. We need to document the boss's actions so that we can share these examples with other workers and then take action. Ultimately, that led to that worker and that whole workplace no longer being surveilled. So, it's one thing to accept, yes, technology is in the hands of bosses, but we've got to take it back.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Let's have a look here. Gemma, did you have anything to add to that? I think I picked the wrong question, but it was a similar topic.
The one about technology.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess echoing Asker, I don't think that there's a world in which we can kind of exist without these tools. And at the end of the day, this is obviously something we talk about a lot with Common Knowledge, of the question of do you build something completely from scratch, which has all the right kind of philosophy and like strategy and everything baked in, or do you just use tools that are readily available? And often it's it just makes more sense to just use the tools that you have while remaining critical of them, but like, yeah, recognizing that we live within late capitalism and we can't escape it. And yeah, we just have to kind of use what's there and try to build something else.
Cool, thanks. Let me look at some of the questions here. There's a question here about the examples of any bigger unions using similar tools, or how can we encourage more unions to use them? I don't know whether Callum or Jake wants to jump in on that one as to whether maybe historically what the kind of the larger scale unions, have they used anything similar, or are their methods of kind of collation of different kinds of knowledge is fairly down the line? I'm unaware, but I think Callum and Jake might have something to say.
I mean, I can talk about currently. I know that some of the big, I'm also a member, so I dual card because I work in the public sector of Unite. And I know Unite uses some of these tools. I mean, I would say that they use them slightly differently sometimes, whereby it's, the process, for example, of mapping the workplace is done and it's held in the kind of hands of the kind of paid staff representative. Rather than, I guess, the way that we've been trying to use these tools is kind of empowering workers to go away and use them by themselves. I mean, I don't know, Callum, whether you want to speak to the kind of historical aspect of that.
Yeah, I mean, historically, particularly to go back to the example of Ismo. So you're talking about Italy in the early mid 60s. A lot of the initial use of workers' inquiry was really striated by this question, right? There were groups of, so operaismo just means workerism, right? There were groups of workerists who wanted to use workers' inquiry to reconnect the big unions and parties with the working class. They had this sense that there was too much of a division, that the ways of organizing and the ways of communicating about politics that had arisen out of the anti-fascist resistance at the end of World War II had become somehow distanced from the new Italian working class that was being created in these huge car factories in kind of places like Turin, etc. And this new northern Italian working class was made up of migrants. It was very different. Often they didn't have the reverence for the anti-fascist resistance that their parents did or that their predecessors in the factory did. And they wanted to understand this new working class so that they could make that reconnection. Right. And they saw the fact that the working class was like not particularly plugged into the traditional union ways of doing things as a real problem. But there were also another group of workerists who viewed this as a real opportunity. They were like, the big unions aren't connected to the workers in the workplace, so we can use workers' inquiry to kind of create something new and more radical, right? We can push beyond the traditional form of party union relationship with the workers in the Fiat factory and instead create something that's more accelerated. I don't think either one of them ever had particular success, right? Operaismo as an actual movement ends in a very difficult moment. It transitions into this whole period of the years of lead in Italy, and political circumstances get very, very difficult for the left. But I think there are definitely ambivalences within the method, that it can be used in some ways by people with very, very different political ends. And so, it's not a politics, it's a method. Right, you deploy the method in certain political ways, in the same way we're talking about, the multivalence of tools, the way you can use tools for both positive and negative ends. In the same way, you can use workers' inquiry to many ends. So I'd say, big unions certainly use part of these. Often, when the method isn't directed from the rank and file, it becomes less participatory, less kind of genuinely open, and more directed towards achieving like short-term goals. But certainly, unions are interested in power mapping. They're interested in surveys, etc., etc. I think that for me, it's not about saying that, it's only good when small unions do it, or it's only good when rank and file workers do it. It's only good when big unions do it. It's about saying that, what we really care about here is what are the politics of the method? How is the method being deployed? And is it being deployed in a way that accelerates the class struggle?
Thanks, Callum. So we had a really great question just a second ago around how's the best way to get into the tool. So I think I'm just picking out a couple here. I think that there are many which you can kind of really just walk into, basically. So, for example, and to pick up on another question about map making, or are there mapping tools in here? And yes, there are, basically. And I think it's a really interesting question about mapping your workplace. We've left a few prompts in that section of the site. Very simple, just like drawing a map of your workplace and then asking a set of questions such as like, where can't you go in your workplace? You know, where are certain members of staff or just people, where are restricted areas, where are not? You start seeing these kind of lines, almost you can draw a path of what's publicly accessible and what isn't. And so I think mapping itself, just visually mapping your workplace is something which, you know, how often do we do that? We never do that. But ultimately thinking about where can you spend breaks, for example, which, you know, spaces are associated with hierarchies, which are places charged with tension where you can't stay for long. These kind of questions really come out, and you can start, you know, perhaps color code those areas of the map. I think that's quite a nice one to start with. There's also another one in the network mapping section of the tool, the whole network analysis. Now, I think the network mapping stuff, just another shout out to Patrick Carmichael, because I think some of the network mapping methods were my favorite, and I think the ones which I discovered for the first time here, because a lot of these methods don't necessarily just come from the strict tradition of workers' inquiry, but of also part of our research, part of Patrick's research was drawing from very adjacent kind of disciplines. And some of these network mapping methods really I think are very revealing, very easy to do. So they might be a good way in. So for example, identifying connecting individuals who are basically, if they, for example, make small but really pivotal decisions within the workplace. So noting who are the connectors and who are the pivotal individuals who you might want to talk to for a particular reason. Structural holes is another concept in there. So where a kind of a single break of communication between, let's say, departments or between individuals could really disrupt a particular process, which might be important when it comes to thinking about where the power lies. So, I mean, maybe I'm just too schematic in my thinking here, but I think the network mapping section is one of my favorites, and it's fairly simple to get into. And I like to think, although we want your feedback, that the kind of step-by-step, kind of almost like recipe style of presentation is fairly accessible. And as I say, like, you know, particularly with the mapping, the drawing, the visual mapping, that's something you can really be quite experimental with and quite innovative with to really unpack and get to kind of approach your workplace from a bird's eye view, for example. I don't know if, Gemma, you have anything else to say on what do you think are the best ways into this tool?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say the same, that the network mapping ones are a good place to start, because you literally can just get a big piece of paper and pens and do it as a group as well, and kind of see things that you wouldn't otherwise. And then I guess kind of lead up to something like an interview. Like having a conversation with someone is not complicated, but like, you know, crafting the questions properly, etc., can be, and like reflecting on them. So that's kind of like, I guess, probably the next step up. But there's also, I guess, one of the things to say as well is like, or to repeat, I guess, is that this particular resource isn't exhaustive, and there's definitely like lots of, you know, if you kind of identify like from the advantages, like, okay, doing this kind of dual ethnography or like some other kind of interview or, you know, consciousness raising discussion is useful. Like there are also other resources online that can kind of give a bit more kind of steer on how to do those, I guess.
I mean, another one which is not visual mapping, but I think it's a really kind of interesting social kind of noting is around affiliate networks as well. So thinking about who you talk to on a day-to-day basis, and then marking those who you would ask for advice and for direction, and those who you give advice and direction to. So noting chains of let's say it might be called soft power or chains of kind of like very tacit, kind of day-to-day, hard to express kind of social relations. So just going through and asking where the cascade of direction and advice comes from. That's just something very simple, but also something which you can probably start creating a wider and wider network map of. So that's quite interesting too. I think they're quite simple really, but I think very revealing. That's the point, as Callum and Gemma have said as well, that you can kind of start with very few materials and build out just with a few guides, a few steers. Okay, any other questions picked out from the audience? Well, yeah, I can't see. I don't think there's any more unless someone wants to pick up on them. Let's perhaps. I mean, should we do a last round of points for everyone? I'm not sure. I think we can probably just end it there. Unless anyone's got anything else to say. Any final points before we let everyone else get onto the evening, the first summer evening, perhaps?
Could I say one thing on a reflection? Because we did this 2 years workers inquiry, which we were really like, we need to understand everything about the sector before we set up this branch of UVW. And I guess one of all of our reflections is probably we spent too much time doing the research. So I guess I would just give a kind of a note of caution, like don't just focus on the research, but also, it should be always paired with organizing your workplace. But yeah, I just thought it was important to say that.
No, yeah, it's a good point. Sometimes knowledge can seem like knowledge for knowledge's sake, but this is precisely not that kind of knowledge. Yeah, thanks for making that. That's a good point to end on, a good hammering home. So thanks for all our speakers. Thanks, Callum, Asker, and Jake. It's really good to hear from people who are trying to put works inquiry into practice, or have done actually. And from Autonomy, thanks to Common Knowledge for being such great working partners on this. And thanks TWT for hosting this, and for everyone for joining us. And we'll see you again for another TWT event soon. Subscribe to TWT. See ya.
Imagine, demand, and build a world transformed.